There are many designers who prefer to do their pencil sketches on graph paper. In fact, many times when working inside of Illustrator, it may be helpful to use a grid to assist in laying out your artwork. To view your grid, you would go to the View menu and choose this option here called Show Grid. The grid itself is made up of larger squares with smaller subdivisions inside of it. Going back to the View menu for a moment here, you'll see there's a setting here called Snap to Grid. When this setting is turned on, as you move objects around on your artboard, it will snap to these squares on the grid. This can be very helpful in different types of design, but perhaps more importantly is getting the grid to be set up so that it represents exactly what you need it to. To do that, we'll go to Preferences. I'll press Command-K on a Mac or Control-K on Windows to bring up the Preferences dialog box, and then from the pop-up menu, I'll go to where it says Guides and Grid. If you take a look at my artwork, you can see that my artwork hides the grid. In other words, the grid appears behind my artwork. That's because this setting, Grids in Back, is turned on. If I turn this option off, I will actually see my grid as if it were overlaid on top of my artwork, which sometimes is helpful, but when I've been working, it kind of gets in the way. The main setting that you care about, though, is how many grid lines you set and how many subdivisions each grid line has. The grid line refers to the darker lines that appear over here. Currently, my document is set up so that each of these grid lines appears every inch in my document. And then that's split up further into 8 subdivisions. You might notice for a minute, though, that on my screen, you only see 4 subdivisions. That's because the zoom level that I'm currently at in my document only displays half of the subdivisions. For example, I'm going to click OK, and if I zoom in a little bit closer in my document, you'll now see that there are 8 subdivisions between each of my grid lines. Just to give you a basic idea about how I use grids, if I'm working in web design, I do care very much about pixel dimensions. So I like to set a grid line every 10 pixels. That way, as I'm working, I can quickly count off 10, 20, 30, 40, and see how big an object is. I'll then specify 10 subdivisions, which means that every square on my artboard will reference 1 pixel. Another way that you might use guides is when trying to lay out a room. For example, if you're trying to do interior design, and you want to make sure that furniture or other elements inside of that room will fit perfectly, you might set it up so that your grid lines represent a foot with 12 subdivisions and each subdivision references an inch. In reality, there are many reasons why you might want to use a grid inside of Illustrator. Just know that it's there and that you can control it. I'll zoom back out again, and remember to hide your grid, you can go back to the View menu and then choose Hide Grid. It's important to realize that all these settings that Illustrator has to help you line up your artwork, be it the guides that we spoke about in the previous movie or the grid here in this movie, you always have complete control over them. So I can turn off the grid here if I don't need to see it. And if you also want to hide the guides that you've created, that can also be controlled from the View menu. Simply go to View, choose Guides, and choose to hide your guides.